Welcome back, everyone. We are diving into a topic today that I know a lot of you have requested, and that is timeouts.
Definitely a hot button issue.
Yeah, it can be kind of controversial and a lot of strong feelings about it. And you specifically asked for like strategies that work, that are based on science and not just,
Right.
what your mom told you or what you read on some random website.
Right.
So we dug into this research article. It was like a meta-analysis of tons of studies about timeouts over decades
Yeah, decade.
and compared it to like what parenting books and websites say.
Yeah, because I think we're all kind of curious, like, how does that all stack up? What's the evidence, and how does it compare to, like, what's out there? What advice are we getting?
Absolutely. So to kick us off, is timeout actually effective?
Yeah, so the research is really clear that timeout, when done correctly, is very effective,
Okay.
but it gets a bad rap because of misunderstandings or misuse.
Okay, so it's not about just like punishing a child. It's like a strategic break.
Right.
So what does the research say about like how to actually implement timeout the right way?
There are 8 key parameters that the research has identified.
Okay.
Some have more evidence behind them than others. But it's really interesting, like some of this really goes against conventional wisdom about timeout.
Oh, I like it when it goes against the grain, like busting myths.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so what's a good place to start with these parameters?
Well, let's start with duration because this is where like the research really upends a lot of what we hear.
Okay,
So how many times have you heard like the 1 minute per year of age rule?
all the time.
Oh yeah, right? That's like timeout 101.
Yeah, it's like the golden rule of timeout.
And it turns out it's a myth.
Are-
Like shorter timeouts, as short as even 1 minute, can be just as effective as longer ones.
Really?
Sure.
So why would that be? Why would just a short break make a difference?
So the key concept behind timeout is to remove reinforcement of a behavior.
Okay.
Reinforcement being anything that increases the likelihood of that behavior happening again. So it could be attention, it could be access to a toy or an activity. It could even be, a frustrated reaction from you, like you getting upset.
Right, so even just that pause breaks that reinforcement cycle.
Exactly. And so the point is not to like punish for an extended period of time, but really just to disrupt that pattern to give the child a chance to like reset, you know,
Oh, that's interesting.
and that can avoid, these big, long, drawn out power struggles and still get you to the same outcome.
Okay. So it's a huge relief to parents who are like dreading the 20-minute standoffs.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, so what's the next parameter we should look at?
I've talked about contingent versus non-contingent release.
What?
Sounds fancy.
Yeah.
But contingent release just means that the kid has to do something before they can leave timeout.
Okay.
So maybe they have to be quiet for a certain amount of time.
Right.
Non-contingent is they're just in there for a set amount of time.
Okay, so is one of those better than the other?
Surprisingly, most of the research shows that there's no difference in effectiveness between the two.
Wow, so it's kind of up to the parent.
Yeah, you've got the flexibility to choose what allows you to be consistent, what reduces stress for both of you.
Right, because sometimes you just need to know like, okay, 2 minutes done.
Exactly.
Especially if you're out in public and you need to like just move on.
Yeah, or even just like in your own house and you're like, "Oh, I can't handle a negotiation right now."
Exactly.
Okay.
Okay, so we've talked about duration, we've talked about the release. What about like how often you should use timeout?
Yeah, that's the parameter of schedule. And generally, the advice is to start with a consistent schedule. So every time they do the behavior, they get a timeout.
Makes sense?
Really clear consequence expectation set.
So are there ever times where you don't do that?
There can be exceptions.
Yeah.
So for kids who have what we call high rate problem behaviors, like they're just doing this thing constantly, right?
Right.
Starting with a less frequent schedule can actually be more effective.
Okay, so there's some nuance to it.
There is, yeah. And you really have to think about your child's individual needs, what the behavior is.
Right, like what's appropriate in that moment.
Right.
Okay, this is already like blowing my mind about timeout. What else is there?
So let's talk about warnings.
Ooh, warnings.
How many times,
1, 2.
how many times are you counting to 3 giving all these warnings before a timeout?
I do that all the time. I feel like it's like an instinct.
I know, I do too. And the research suggests that that might not be the best approach.
Really? I would have thought that the more warnings, the better, give them a chance to shape up.
And it seems like one clear warning is sufficient.
Okay.
And all those extra warnings might be detrimental.
How could too many warnings be bad?
So one thought is that all that attention that you're giving during the warnings might be inadvertently reinforcing the behavior.
Oh, that's so interesting.
Yeah, so it's like
Yeah.
you're rewarding the very thing that you're trying to get rid of.
Wow, that's a really good point.
So instead of that 1, 2, 3, Just give a very clear warning. And then if the behavior continues, it's timeout.
Wow.
No more, drawn out warnings.
This is already like so insightful. I'm ready to unpack more of these parameters. What's next?
So another parameter is whether or not to give a verbalized reason for the timeout.
Oh, yeah. This is a tough one.
It is, yeah, and a lot of parents struggle with this.
Because I'm always like, is it better to explain like why they're getting the timeout or just to like do.
Yeah, are they even listening at that point?
Exactly. And sometimes I feel like it just turns into a lecture
Right.
and they're not really absorbing it anyway.
Yeah, so one study actually found that there was no clear benefit to the child's behavior in terms of like reducing the problem behavior
Oh, interesting.
when a reason was given.
So why would we give a reason then?
That's a good question, and the researchers in that study noted that practitioners tend to favor giving a reason.
Okay. So maybe it's more for us.
Yeah, maybe it helps parents be more consistent because they're like, okay, this is why I'm doing this.
It's like the rationale behind it.
Exactly.
Helps us do it better.
Right. So something to think about.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, what's next?
So another one is instructional versus physical administration of timeout.
Okay, break that down for me.
So do you tell the kid to go to timeout or do you physically take them there?
Oh, yeah.
Because we've all been there with the kid who's like refusing to go.
Absolutely, like the dragging to the timeout spot.
All right. And there's not a ton of research on this yet, but one study found success by shortening the duration for kids who complied with the instructions.
Oh, that's interesting.
So they were told to go. If they did it, they got a shorter timeout.
So it's almost like a built-in reward.
It is, yeah. It's like you're incentivizing that cooperation.
Interesting, okay.
Might make the whole process less stressful.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've covered a lot of parameters now. What are we still missing?
So the last two are location and supervision, and then timeout signal.
Okay, let's talk about location and supervision first.
All right, so does it really matter where the timeout is?
That's a good question, because I've heard everything from like it needs to be this boring blank wall to like, as long as they're away from the thing that they were doing, it doesn't matter.
And really the key is that the timeout location removes them from the situation that was reinforcing that behavior.
Okay, so it has to be like less rewarding than what they were doing before.
Exactly.
So like sending them to their room that's full of toys, probably not going to be effective.
Yeah, it depends on the kid, depends on, what's reinforcing them. But yeah, generally you want it to be less rewarding.
Got it. Okay. What about supervision? Do we need to like sit there with them or can they be alone?
So this is one where we actually need more research.
Oh, really?
There isn't a lot of evidence to suggest whether adult supervision during timeout is beneficial or not.
So that's up to the parent.
It is, yeah, for now.
Okay. And then what was the last one? Timeout signal.
Yeah, so is it helpful to use like a timer or a sound or something to mark the beginning or the end?
Right.
No research on that either.
What?
Yeah, just personal preference at this point.
Wow. So we think we know so much about timeout and there's actually so much that's just like unknown.
Right, exactly. Or we think we know, but it's not actually backed by research.
Yeah. And speaking of that, you mentioned that this research paper actually looked at what parenting books and websites recommend.
Yeah.
Compared to the science.
They did a whole section on that.
I'm so curious about this because I think that's where most of us are getting our information.
Right. And I think we can all kind of guess, but what they found is that there's a big gap between what the research suggests and what these resources are recommending.
Oh, no. Wow.
Especially when it comes to the duration of timeouts and the number of warnings.
Like those are the two biggies we've been talking about.
They are, yeah.
Okay, so what were some of the like specific discrepancies?
So a lot of books and websites are still recommending that 1 minute per year of age rule.
Ugh.
Even though studies have shown that shorter timeouts can be just as effective.
Okay.
And they're also recommending multiple warnings before a timeout.
Which we now know is maybe not the best idea.
Might actually be counterproductive.
So it's kind of scary to think that like all this advice is out there and it's not necessarily accurate.
It really highlights the importance of being a critical consumer of parenting information.
Right.
Don't just take everything at face value, even if it's coming from a source that you generally trust.
So where can parents go to get like this evidence-based information?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the researchers actually in this article talked about some evidence-based behavioral parent training programs.
Well, that sounds fancy.
It sounds fancy, but it's basically programs that are designed to teach parents effective parenting strategies
Okay.
based on scientific research.
So they're like evidence-based.
They are, yeah. And that includes, timeout, but it also includes a lot of other things.
Cool.
And they offer a really supportive environment for parents to like learn these skills and practice them. And,
That's awesome.
yeah, another great resource is the American Academy of Pediatrics.
Well, yeah.
They have tons of great evidence-based guidance on discipline and child development.
And, of course, you can always talk to your pediatrician or a therapist.
Absolutely.
Cool. So it sounds like the information is out there.
That is.
We just have to be a little bit more discerning
Yeah.
about what we choose to follow.
Exactly. And remember, too, that timeout is just one tool in your parenting toolbox.
Right.
It's most effective when it's part of a comprehensive approach. That includes things like positive reinforcement, clear communication, consistent boundaries, all those good things.
So for our listener who's maybe feeling a little bit overwhelmed with all this timeout information,
Yeah.
what's like the key takeaway?
You don't have to rely on outdated or unfounded advice.
Yeah.
You can empower yourself with research-backed strategies that are proven to be effective, and that can really help you handle those challenging moments with your kid.
I love that this deep dive has been so insightful. We've learned so much about timeouts and how they can be effective. But we also need to be using them correctly and based on the evidence, and also focusing on creating that positive environment overall so that we don't need to use them as much.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the goal.
So before we wrap up completely, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought to ponder. So we've talked a lot about like the specifics of timeout, the duration, the warnings, all that stuff. But the research also emphasizes the importance of the time and environment.
Yes, the time and environment is huge. It makes such a difference.
I'm so intrigued by this.
Yeah.
Can you explain what you mean by the time and environment?
Yeah, so if you think about it, if a kid's regular environment isn't very rewarding to begin with,
Okay.
then being sent to timeout might not be that big of a deal.
Right. So the contrast isn't strong enough.
Exactly. But if their time and environment is full of, positive interactions, fun things to do, things that they enjoy,
Right.
then going to timeout is like, oh, I'm really missing out on something.
It's like the difference between like missing a boring lecture versus missing like a party.
Exactly. That's
Yeah.
a great way to put it.
Okay.
So the idea is that if you focus on creating a really positive and rewarding time and environment, you might not even need to use timeout as much.
I love that. What are some practical tips for doing that?
It really comes down to being intentional and present with your kids, making time for those one-on-one interactions, engaging in activities that they love, creating a home environment that feels, safe and supportive and fun.
And all of those other, positive parenting techniques that we've talked about before, like the praise and the rewards and, teaching emotional regulation, all of that.
Yes, all of that contributes to this positive time and environment.
And then timeout is kind of like a last resort,
Yeah.
not like the go-to all the time.
Exactly.
I love it. Well, this has been such an insightful deep dive into the world of timeouts. We've learned they can be effective, but we got to use them correctly and based on the evidence.
Yeah.
And, also focusing on that positive environment overall. That's the key.
For our listener, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive, and we hope you learned something new and maybe changed your perspective on timeouts a little bit.
It's been a pleasure.
We'll see you next time.